Hi everyone, it's Maddie Brady. We're here to get real about mental health. Stay tuned for some great conversations with some very special guests. Hi everyone, welcome to Get Real. We are here with Stephanie from the Harris Project. Thank you so much for coming.
And thanks for having me, Maddie.
Of course. And can you tell everyone what the Harris Project is?
Sure. So I founded the Harris Project in 2013 after my 19-year-old son Harris died by accidental overdose. He had something called co-occurring disorders, which most people have never heard of, but once I explain what it is, people are like, why isn't everybody talking about it? So it's the relationship between mental health and substance misuse and addiction. So I started the Harris Project at my kitchen table. Harris died on a Wednesday. His funeral was on Sunday. And between Wednesday and Sunday, I just had this vision of what I wanted to kind of explain to the world.
Wow. That's really powerful. Very powerful message. And so I kind of knew what co-occurring disorders are. I more so thought it was, so I went to a facility for co-occurring disorders, but it was eating disorders and alcohol abuse for mine, but you could have any combination of two, but it seems like more were both external symptom uses of disorders rather than what you talk about. So I was watching some of your stuff and reading some of your stuff, and I had the same thought, like, duh, why isn't everybody talking about this?
So that's kind of what happened. So when Harris died, I started doing research literally at my kitchen table. He was 19. His friends are coming home. My daughter is a senior in high school. And I'm trying to literally unpack how every single program he went to said he had co-occurring disorders. He was in 4 inpatient rehabilitation programs, primarily substance use, 2 outpatient. And they said he has co-occurring disorders. We treat co-occurring disorders, but they never actually got to the mental health piece. So when he died, we were right in the middle of it still being called dual diagnosis, but there was the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, which is the federal agency, and their guide called it co-occurring disorders. And I said, well, that's what the program said, and that's what we're going to roll with. And so I agree. There are the mental health factors that lead into it and the resulting sort of self-medication or coping mechanism for the purposes of co-occurring disorders, it's substances.
Yes.
But I see where gambling, online gaming, social media addictions, unhealthy relationships with food, that non-suicidal self-injury, that those are sort of those end results, coping mechanisms. But for our purposes and for the work that I do, we really stick to the definition.
Yeah. And what exactly was he suffering from that led to addiction?
So Harris was diagnosed when he was 3 years old with an anxiety disorder. He spoke really early. He walked really early. He was a very deep thinking little kid, which gave him a lot of worry. And so the diagnosis was there when he was 3. In 8th grade, he picked up the ADHD diagnosis. He had had a really challenging 8th grade experience. He was smoking marijuana. We didn't know it. The therapist he was seeing did. And so he thought he was just experimenting. So again, all of these kind of moments where messages could have been different really impacted my course and my trajectory, because if he's seeing mental health professionals and they're not saying, Harris, good-looking, popular social kid like you, but you struggle so much with an anxiety disorder, you need to be really careful around substances because that could be a spiral you go down really quickly. First opportunity for things to be different. First opportunity for him to think, like, when he's starting to use substances, oh, this could be problematic, or, oh, it already is feeling problematic. This is a real thing.
Yeah. I remember hearing too, I know you go around and you talk to high schools and all of that, which is great. I remember a speaker came to our high school when we were younger, and he was in recovery from addiction issues. And I remember him saying that anyone can get addicted and it doesn't matter your background, race, religion, anything like that. Anyone can get addicted. But I never do remember learning that, oh, if you have ADHD, you might be more susceptible, or if you have OCD, if you have anxiety, anything like that. I think in recovery, you start to learn about yourself and you start to unpack all of that. So if you get to a recovery stage, you do sometimes realize, oh, I had really bad anxiety or depression or whatever it was, but I don't remember learning about that at all.
Right. So to
growing
me, it's
up.
like that knowledge is power piece. So,
Yeah.
for the audience that cares just like about the data, like, how does this happen? So if 22% of our kids, 13 to 18, have a mental health disorder with severe impact, and 50% of those arise by 14 and 75% by 24, mental health disorders are disorders of the young. And the ages of onset align with when young people experiment with substances. So the clear link, and the majority of people with co-occurring disorders have an emerging or an existing mental health disorder. So that's the biggest pool, the highest risk group.
Wow.
But then on the flip side, so now, I'm sitting there and I've got an audience of like 1,000 kids, and like, everybody's like riveted and they're thinking, well, this is really interesting. I never heard of it, but at least I don't have a mental health disorder. Like, I'm good. Another message we completely miss on is they say your brain isn't fully developed until you're 25. But what does that mean? That means that there's chemicals in there. You can't see, touch, taste, feel, or smell them, but they're in there. And every time you smoke marijuana, vape, take edibles, you drink, you're prescribed opioids for a sports injury, or using any kind, you run the risk of changing your brain chemistry and developing a mental health disorder, even if you weren't on track to.
Wow.
So what's the secret?
Yeah. So if you're drinking super young or anything like that, that's something that can actually bring a mental health issue to light.
Absolutely. You can develop anxiety, depression, panic, particularly with marijuana use. There are a lot of young people who report, like, I thought it was just going to mellow me out, but now I have panic attacks. And I have panic attacks when I use, and I have panic attacks when I don't use. And so, again, this connection and thinking about your why. I always say, so you may start out thinking you're doing it just because you want to go to the party, you're bored, you're living in the suburbs, whatever. But at what point might it cross over? And who are you going to talk to about it?
Yeah. See, I didn't even know that. I knew with acid, ketamine, some of those harder, more psychedelic drugs, I knew that could bring out bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, a lot of other disorders if they are laying dormant in our genes. But I had no idea marijuana, drinking, all of that could do so.
100%. And it's another one of those things I say, here's Harris's story. He said to me, 2 weeks before he died, he said, had I never started smoking marijuana, none of this would have happened. And he was addicted to whatever pills that he could take. And I was like, I don't understand. Even like as an adult, I didn't get it. And he said, well, sometimes the marijuana mellowed me out. More often than not, it made me more panicky, and I couldn't stop. And then I went to that party. The pills were available, and that was when everything just numbed out. Wow. And that was when I was really in trouble. And I probably wouldn't have even taken those pills if I wasn't using marijuana. Wow. So that's kind of that link up.
Yeah. And what's crazy is most people say that marijuana like doesn't really do anything, and in theory it can't kill you, right, and all of that. But I mean, that just goes to show you that it does. It is. People always taught it was a gateway drug, and then people went against grain and said it wasn't, but it truly is.
It depends on the person. It depends on the experience. But that's why I think this entire experience is so much more personal. Trauma fits into this, young people who live in unsafe environments, or there's, community violence and gun violence, how easy it is to navigate to substances. Athletes, so I'm not particularly athletic, as you might notice, but Harris was a student athlete, and I do a lot of programming at the college level and even at the high school level with student athletes. Athlete gets injured. They get prescribed opioids legally. Do they know they can become addicted or dependent in 5 days or less? Do they know that there might be depression that comes from the break in routine? Like, we want to build community safety nets where everybody kind of knows what the risks are. Everybody knows what to look out for.
Yeah. I had a girl on here just the other week that had a problem with prescription pills. And she said the same thing when she went to the doctor. They really did not educate her at all, right, the side effects. They say something here and there, but they really don't go into the details of where it can lead. And then on the other hand, I know people that got in accidents and started taking, and who did eventually, unfortunately, overdose. Right. And it just all comes from a broken bone or an athletic injury, or I was saying too that they prescribe it for wisdom teeth.
Yes.
Like, that is just unnecessary. And how do you think we can really stop that.
So again, I don't necessarily think that you're going to change every old-fashioned dentist. I feel like some of the more new, up to who are really doing the research know that you shouldn't, and know that 90% plus 99% of cases you don't need it, and you don't even need to write the prescription. But educating the consumer is really where I think, for me, and why I'm so happy to be on with you today, Maddie, is because, I can reach the young people who I reach, but you have a completely different audience, and it's the consumer experience. It's for you. If you're seeing a mental health professional and they're not talking about the risks of substance use, you can educate that mental health professional on co-occurring disorders and why the message is so important. Mm-hmm. If you're needing to go in for treatment, what are you asking? Harris would go into these programs, we would be all optimistic. They were never going to be successful for him if they really didn't integrate the mental health piece. So it's like a whole nother part of the work that I do is on the system side, like what we're delivering in treatment, because we've created this vision that you either have to be lucky to make it out the other side or strong enough. You don't say that about cancer. You don't say that about heart disease. You want the best treatment protocol written for your success. You don't want to get lucky to make it out or get the one good clinician in a program. You want the things that are going to really work for you.
Yeah. And I've been to places that just didn't click, and it just felt like every single thing about it just did not resonate with me, was not working. I felt like sometimes how is this even treatment for what I'm seeking help for? So that would be amazing if they were able to change the system. And I've said before, even sometimes the system set up where you're almost addicted to the system. Luckily for me, I really only sought help one time that was unsuccessful, then one time that was, but a lot of people in the facility I was at were in treatment for years, years and years, a million different places. And a lot of people that even come on here and got sober say, I went to 14 rehabs, 22 rehabs. The numbers are astounding. And a lot of people aren't able to make it to the 22nd rehab. And it's like, what is going wrong at all those other ones? And there obviously are parts that can be approved upon.
Yes. So that, for the most part, Harris would walk in, they would take away all the substances, even the ones he was prescribed for his mental health. They would put him in a group, not based on what brought him to use. He wasn't in a group with young people with anxiety disorders. He was just there with whoever came in at that moment. He could fix you. He would talk about this one. He would do anything but talk about himself. He would say, they keep saying, remember life before substances. I love my family. I love my friends, my house, my clothes, but my brain works a million miles an hour. And if they don't give me tools for that, when I get out of here, how is it going to change? And so it would become this revolving door. So prevention and early intervention is sort of my happy place. That's where co-occurring disorders awareness, CODA, the logo, the brand, the real empowerment piece is really great. But I knew that as you're educating young people about this, that there are going to be some that start recognizing themselves in the story. And I knew how much of a failure the system was for us. I'm an attorney by training, former PTA president, school board member. How is this happening? And Harris was so committed. So then I started doing work in the system side. So looking at how the federal government writes a treatment protocol and it sits on a shelf and collects dust, because every state in this country decides what it does with its mental health and its substance use dollars. For the most part, even if they live under the same roof, they're siloed. The money is separate. The programming is separate. If you have one, if you're, they don't do things integrated. They do them separately. And so for me, I work across New York State. And now, because there was a piece in the New York Times about our work, I'm hearing from other people around the country, and I'm kind of giving them the tools to start the conversation, to look at how their opioid settlement dollars are being used, because there is a blueprint to get this right.
Yeah.
What you've probably experienced with people are the ones who've had sequential treatment. By that I mean, so you go into the substance use program, and even if they say they deal with co-occurring disorders, they don't really. And then they say you're going to get to the mental health after. The sequence is substance use first, then we'll see what's going on, and then we'll treat your mental health. Not evidence-based.
Yeah.
Then you have something called simultaneous treatment, which is what Harris got when he came out of the first program. So me, the stay-at-home mom, I was taking him, he was a senior in high school, right at the end of senior year. 12-step meeting, intensive outpatient program, psychologist, psychiatrist, and the gym. Recurrence and use in under 2 weeks. Integrated evidence-based treatment, you can have once-a-week therapy that focuses on you and your stuff and be far more successful, even more complicated than Harris was.
Wow. That is crazy. And it is almost crazy how corrupt the system is, that when there's dollars involved and there's finances and all of that, that it seems like everything somehow gets messed up, how they're siloing the treatments and all of that, instead of actually putting the money towards the research to figure out how do we actually stop this.
Now you're going to kind of chuckle because you say research. So in my presentation, there's a slide that talks about what we want to do, and the word research is there, and there's a line through it. And I always say, I'm like, so if you're the student who really wants to change the world and get involved in public health and policy, pay attention to why there's a line through when I get to it. And the line is through it because the treatment protocols are written, because you don't have to do research to get this right. Even when we look at medication for opioid use disorder, in and of itself, it could be successful for some people, but it's supposed to be part of a whole integrated treatment plan where you're seeing a clinician, where the medication is enhancing your recovery. It's not like, magic bullet, you take this, you're going to be good. And so it's really a matter of getting people to first understand what co-occurring disorders is, then to begin to look at the system that exists in their state, and then actually go to meetings and start being heard. I mean, I sit on the New York State Opioid Settlement Fund Advisory Board, more than $2.1 billion. And in New York State now, every single proposal that goes out, anybody applying has to demonstrate what they're doing in co-occurring disorders.
That's great. That's good. So it actually is changing.
Working really hard to try to make it happen.
Yeah. Wow. And I think it's great too. So I'm kind of right at the age where I was a bit older when people started talking about mental health. It was not really a thing people recognized as much as they do now. And now younger and younger kids are getting diagnosed properly and do know what they have. So they even have the opportunity to say, oh, I do have ADHD. I'm not going to start drinking. Or I do have anxiety, so I'm going to be really careful. When I just remember growing up, like, it was just such a minute percent that actually knew what they had or knew what they were dealing with. When we got to that party age, it was kind of just a free-for-all, and nobody really knew, oh, I actually have a mental health condition. I shouldn't be partying this hard. Or
I don't think you know what? I think you're giving the system a little more credit than it deserves, because, for the young people that I'm with, and now it's kind of even leaning into middle school, it's still not abundantly clear that mental health matters, which, I mean, how many t-shirts are emblazoned with mental health matters? May is mental health month, but not really talking about why. Not saying, you've got this going on, and so you need to be careful about this. You've got this going on, what is your relationship with food, with online gaming, with all of the things that can become addictive for young people who are trying to just feel like anybody else. Like, I always say, people who are using substances with a mental health disorder aren't looking to party. They're looking to go to the party feeling like the way they feel like everybody else feels. And so I think that there's still a disconnect with the messaging. There's still that piece that's missing. Even they do a lot now in high school about refusal skills. And I will say that the refusal skills still land very much in the space of, say you're on an antibiotic, say you have to get up early in the morning, and that just moves the conversation to another day. I think that if a young person develops the confidence to say, so, I have an anxiety disorder, and it's a door I don't want to open, and that's my why, and that's good enough for me. I think that's where the change happens. I think that's where it becomes I'm not judging you for what you're doing. I'm just making a decision that works for me. And I can live in this environment with you doing what you're doing, but don't ask me again because it's not
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah, no, the first excuses reminded me of when I was in early sobriety, like, oh, I have to drive and I don't even have a car there and stuff like that. But then when you actually practice saying it and being assertive about it, it becomes everyday life and normal.
Right.
And if someone else feels uncomfortable by your response, that's not your responsibility to worry about. And being able to instill that in young children would be amazing.
Right.
And even in the New York Times article, the line about how doctors kept telling him to go back and try to remember what they felt like before substance use, that hit me really hard because I remember when I wanted to get sober, wanted to stop using eating disorder symptom use, I would always think about, I just want to go back to normal. I just want to go back to normal. But at this point, I actually feel better than normal because there was something wrong with my normal growing up
Right.
that I didn't know quite what it was. But there was something off that made me feel like I didn't fit in, that I wasn't fully there, that now I'm actually better than that normal. So I think that that is really bad advice to go back to that normal, because I'm sure if it's 99% of people that get into substance use start it because they didn't feel normal.
Right. And I could not agree more. And so like when you think of like your happy place, like that wasn't, yeah, like he had all of like the comforts. He had a loving family, but if your internal is not wired in a way that looks like everybody else's and you're struggling, I mean, Harris, like another part of the problem for him was, what you think of when you think of somebody who's struggling with their mental health. Typically, you think of somebody who's not super social. They're kind of hanging back. They're not in the middle of everything. And so you don't give enough credit to the experience of the person. Here you are doing a podcast, but you've struggled with stuff. And so people would, well, how could she have a podcast? She can't do that. And how could he play soccer? How could he be all league and all section when he went back to playing? And that didn't negate the fact that every time he thought about getting on that away soccer bus, it was a really bad day for him. How was he going to say, I'm a super cool kid, but I'm so anxious that I'm going to get into a lot of trouble today because maybe they won't even let me go.
Yeah.
And we don't give enough understanding. Like we're very punitive with our young people, not really looking at the kind of things that we can do to support as opposed to kind of blame and shame.
Yeah. And I think just looking at people, just their appearance and their accolades and all of that, and not realizing that there is internal struggle. I mean, I grew up being an athlete as well, and I remember too, like just thinking everyone else's lives were perfect, and the best swimmers, the best runners, all of them, they must be living these perfect lives. And then as I got older, I realized how much sadness and anxiety and addiction and all of that was in the athletic community that I grew up with. It turned out that a lot of people had eating disorders. A lot of people were drinking too much or got into drug use, or a lot of times those high functioning people, or high achieving people rather, are ones that are internally struggling. And just because you're a high achieving person, that has nothing to do with your internal struggle.
Right. And so this level of like surprise that we have. So, even in this country, we silo the causes of death. So it's sort of the overdose bucket, the suicide bucket. And I mean, nobody really even talks about alcohol related deaths anymore, even though those are actually higher than the other two. But like more than in 2021, 262,000 people died of those three things combined.
Oh my gosh.
If you look at it through my lens, the majority of them had co-occurring disorders and probably never knew. So when we kind of pigeonhole and say, well, this is what we're going to like have a walk for this, we're going to do this for that. It's like, it's the same people, come on. Like, if you really look at it and I'm hoping that when you're thinking about it, when you're interviewing other people, like co-occurring disorders, it doesn't just roll off the tongue so easily, but that's what you're thinking about. Like, this is another person that had it. This is another person that had it. Statistics are that 50% of people who are in treatment for a mental health disorder have a co-occurring substance use disorder.
Yeah.
On the other way around, it's like they say it's something like 70%, but I'm going to say that I've been at panels, at workshops. The medical profession will say that almost everybody with getting treatment for a substance use disorder have a mental health disorder or trauma as well.
Yeah. And even when I remember, like, when I was getting into treatment and starting to look at the other people with using multiple symptom uses, and then the more and more you see in recovery, you meet people that they say, oh, I used drugs and I had eating problems. I used drugs and I had gambling problems. And I look back and I had even more than I realized. Like, it wasn't just eating. It wasn't just drugs and alcohol. It was relationship issues and attachment issues. And there are so many other things. And those are all just symptom uses of the actual issue,
right?
The internal issues that are going on. So there are so many smaller issues that we might not even realize because it's not as evident as, oh, I might die from drinking too much or not eating enough or all of that. There's other parts of our life that are being affected by this.
And that's why for me, like, I like collaborating with everybody. Like, I kind of view co-occurring disorders as the larger umbrella. And so if you're talking about any of those topics, I fit into the conversation. And so again, like, it's all about building relationships. You know, I entered this space not, with a mental health or substance use background, mom, lived experience, and just thought I needed to do something. So my daughter, who was going to college, I needed to get up. My husband was going back to work. Like, what was going to get me motivated? And I think that for parents who have a child that dies, for some, getting out of bed in the morning is enough. And I give them all the credit in the world for being able to do that. For me, I needed to change what I saw as a failure. And the failure is that all of those different multi-symptom things that people use to cope and manage, out of the gate, the conversation could be changed just by identifying the fact that having this can lead to that. People are like, oh, you don't want to label. There's power from understanding I have depression, which makes it more risky for me to do certain things. You wouldn't do that. If you've got diabetes in your family, you want to let people know what to watch out for. Like, why is everything around mental health? And we do a lot of comparing and contrasting. Like, young people will say, well, it's not as bad for me as it is for somebody else. You still deserve access to the right kind of care. You shouldn't say, I need to reach a certain level before I can get help, which is what we do. Like, most of the kids in this country who need mental health help don't get it. When they finally get it, they get it when they're complicated, and then they go to providers who really don't know what to do with them. Like, we don't check in and check up on our mental health.
Yeah, it is almost to get help or to reach a point of actually wanting to get help or feeling like you need help. It feels like you have to hit this rock bottom or really take it to the next level or just progressively get worse, when it's like, why aren't we treating this right away out of the gate?
Right, like they're teetering into crisis, and then it's like, this, everybody's spidey senses are tingling, you kind of know something's going on, and then it's like the big moment, and like that's what you do. But you wouldn't do that like if you had a peanut allergy. Like, nobody would say like, you waiting for the first anaphylactic reaction, then we'll give you the EpiPen, or like you tear your ACL. They don't say, oh, you walk around. When you really can't walk, that's when we'll talk about surgery. And with mental health, that's what we do. We wait and wait and wait, and then other ways to cope and manage kind of enter into the picture. And we've missed the opportunity to kind of do it, because once you've had the first use and addiction starts happening, it's a much harder way to deal with what's going on. It's a much more complicated way to address somebody's needs.
Yeah. And even back to the part where you were saying your brain's not fully developed till you're 25, beside the fact that you can actually make things worse by using drugs and alcohol and all of that, a lot of mental health issues don't even arise until you're in your later teens. So people could start using so young and not even realize what they have or what was going to come out that was dormant in their genes. Because I know bipolar comes out between 18 and 25. I think it's the same for schizophrenia. I'm not even sure, but a lot of issues develop later
Yes.
in teenage years.
And some of it, I actually was on a podcast with 3 moms who have adult children with schizophrenia, and each one, the young person had been using marijuana when they were younger, and they never actually thought about like sort of the anxiety, depression, self-medication with marijuana, and then later schizophrenia. So there's a link between all of that as well. Like, would it have come out if you hadn't used any substances? And all of that is to say, really being mindful of what's going on, really creating, families and communities that understand it to support, but then looking at how the system continues to fail. Like, there are things that should be just matter of course. When you're going for mental health care and you're 25 and under, part of the conversation should be about relation, not just saying, well, you're drinking, or, the medication's not going to be as effective if you're using. No, really saying, what can happen, and then charging it back to the, if, you may think I'm just saying this, do your own research, like do your own reading about what this is. And that's where the change happens. And then, you look at kind of clubs in schools. So typically a club will either be kids who have been struggling and, the club kind of like wants them to all sit together, or the club is like the good kids who want to like put it on their resume. What we do with CODA is to really get a cross section, and nobody gets kicked out and nobody's in trouble if they're using, and really creating the opportunity for, like, if Harris was in a club in high school that really talked about this, it might not have changed what he was doing in that moment. But when he started getting into trouble, he would have realized he wasn't alone. I feel like so many people, when it goes wrong, feel like other people are doing it and it doesn't look problematic. Why is it a problem for me? And if you understood that concretely, then you could do things differently, or you could share with somebody. We also encourage kids to like think about who their safe person would be. Who would they share it with? Even if they can't fix it, you want to be able to know you have someone who can listen.
Yeah, definitely. And when I was reading the article, my mouth fell open when I saw he was disowned or discharged by his therapist for smoking marijuana.
Yeah, so that was our 8th grade experience. So in 8th grade, I was on the school board. Harris had stopped playing soccer. As the year progressed, his behaviors started becoming problematic. He was acting out in school. My husband and I were very concerned about his mental health and wellness. He was seeing a professional the school district had recommended. It got so bad that I resigned from the school board. Like, everybody in my community, like, there's nothing wrong with him. He's just trying to get away with stuff because you're important. We're like, we think there's a problem here. Pulled him out and homeschooled him. I resigned from the school board, went to what would be the last meeting with this therapist, who said, Harris has become more than I can manage. And by the way, he's smoking marijuana. I thought he was just experimenting, but he might have a problem. So, youth, anxiety, marijuana, psychosis. Yeah, we had a problem. My son was developing marijuana-induced psychosis, and you, the professional, A, didn't think it was important to tell us, and B, didn't seem to understand like the link either. And so that went wrong. Then he really wanted to go to our high school. He got assessed, picked up that ADHD diagnosis, went on medication for the first time, started doing really well, went back to playing sports, so well that he said, I don't have time. Like, the medication's working. Like, he's on medication for ADHD. I don't need to see the therapist anymore. We're like, yay, we're good. Like, life is good. Went to what would be the last appointment with that therapist, who said, great, like, you're done. I'm discharging you. Did not say, 8th grade was not like a one-off experience. You need to be really careful moving forward. Not saying, Harris, the door is always open. If anything comes up, things change, come see me. No. 11th grade came. ACTs, SATs, and my playing college soccer. That's when the anxiety overwhelmed the medication. We had gone through so much trauma in 8th grade. He didn't want to tell anybody. Went to a party in my town. The prescription pills were on the table. And that's when, within all that time, everything went wrong. That was the end of junior year. And by the day after the St. Patrick's Day parade, his senior year, he went to the first inpatient program.
Wow. That quickly.
Yeah. So, but it's that stuck out to you because our kids, you guys, you don't come with a rule book.
Yeah.
And so, how would we know what to watch out for? So I always put like little nuggets of information. I say to kids, if you're on medication for a mental health disorder, stay connected to a therapist, somebody that you can talk to, a social worker, because it's not always easy to talk to your family and your friends when you're really struggling. You want that neutral, safe person. But you also want to make sure that that person knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
Because if they don't understand the link and they think, oh, it's just a little marijuana, you'll be fine. It's not necessarily the case for you.
Yeah. And what exactly is a psychosis?
It's kind of a bit of a break from reality. And so he really was acting out in ways that were very unpredictable. He was getting in trouble a lot, and he was pushing limits a lot. And we thought that, he was a super smart, empathetic, loving young person, and he was becoming somebody that we didn't really recognize. And he didn't like it, and we didn't like it, but we didn't really know what was going on until we knew what was going on. He's a kid who wrote a lot of poetry, played in a band, but also played sports. He was just very multidimensional and so there for his friends. And so like he could look at you in the hallway and know that like something was off and check in and not just say, you good, but really ask if you were good. And that I think is also a big part of what I try to impart on young people is the connections you build. So, if you see your friend who's in trouble at a party, they're drinking a lot, it's kind of funny. Like, are you taking the pictures and like posting it places, or are you waiting until the next morning and saying, I was concerned when I saw that. This is who I would talk to. Like, can we go talk to somebody? Because it's all fun until it's not fun. And,
Exactly.
You kind of have to listen and vibe what's going on. I always say, don't put yourself in a position where you aren't safe.
Yeah.
And they may not be ready to hear it yet, but you want to be there for somebody.
Yeah, the stuff with Snapchat and the stories and all of that, it really just brings out people putting their friends in dangerous situations or situations where they're probably not feeling great, so they're coping with substances, all of that, and then they post it on their story as if it's funny, and then it becomes a norm. Then 5 people are doing it, 10 people are doing it, then it's super normal. Oh, happy birthday, Veronica. Here's a picture of you blacked out.
Right.
And it's like this funny thing. And it's really exactly what you're saying. It's funny till it's not funny.
Right.
Because that's not funny. Because that girl that's blacked out that you're posting a picture of her passed out for her birthday, she was probably going through some deep internal struggle. And that's why she was doing that.
Yep.
And it's like, then we just normalize this behavior without even asking our friends what's going on.
Right. You become that person. And the expectation is that you're going to always rise to that bar. You're going to be the one who's sloppy. You're going to be the one who's a mess. And we never then get to the root causes of what's going on. So much about reality TV. There are people who are in recovery, like openly, which, is really something to celebrate. But you watch kind of the world around them on these shows and you see how uncomfortable other people are knowing how to really deal with that. And I think that's kind of the next step. So, for me, prevention, early intervention, fun, systems transformation, bringing in evidence-based stuff, really important. But how we as a society interact with people in recovery who are sharing their stories, moving away from that, maybe stepping into this here, but one of the last Al-Anon meetings that I went to, I stood up and was enraged because somebody didn't want to come to a meeting I was going to bring my daughter to because she didn't want my daughter seeing her there because her husband was struggling. And I thought, we are now you're in it, you're anonymous, you're using your first name, you're in the basement of some place, what other disease or disorder do we push people down and discourage them from sharing?
Yeah.
What other disease or disorder do we say, you can talk about your story, but don't talk about your mental health and any medication you might be on, or if you're on medication for opioid use disorder, don't bring that up here. You want to be able to share success, but not success for that little sliver you're allowed to tell, but the whole story that, it took me 10 years because I was in a lot of really crappy programs. Once I got connected to the right therapist, everything made sense for me. Mm-hmm. This way, when somebody's watching that or hearing that story, you're thinking, I should get the right therapist 8 years or 9 years sooner because then I have that much more time to be successful.
Yeah. And that is crazy that she didn't want your daughter going. She would deprive her of that experience, or your daughter getting
No, she was going to
help.
deprive herself. She wasn't going to come.
Oh, she wasn't
literally said,
coming.
"Let me know when
Okay.
your daughter's coming because I don't want her to see me here. I'm not going to come." And I thought,
Oh my gosh.
we say like, you're only as sick as your secrets. Well, your secret is
Yeah.
like is keeping it a secret. You're only allowed to talk about it with people in recovery. No,
Yeah.
and for me, even in grief, I went to a grief group early on, and it honestly made me more anxious.
Yeah.
Every time somebody new came and I had to start over and talk about our story, when everything that I was thinking was, I want to use like sort of Harris's energy and power to educate and empower other people, and not to say like, oh, look at her, she's really moving and shaking, like, why are you still in bed, like, can't you be like Stephanie? Like, it was horrible for me. Like, for me, the energy comes from being with young people who are like awakened to this concept, and then how the larger world can really understand this in a way that's much more supportive than what we're doing.
Yeah, and I think you're able to hit so many different audiences. You're able to hit the young kids that haven't gotten into it yet, the mid-aged people that might know people that are in recovery or know somebody that this happened to. And then also, I think it's important for people like my mom's age to know that there's other people out here and that they're not going through it alone, because I'm sure it's extremely challenging. I've never had the experience, but being a mother and watching your children go through that, like, I know that my mom would be awake crying when I was out and things like that, that there needs to be support for that demographic and people talking about it in that
Yes.
demographic.
100%. And that, is a huge thing. So I hear from families and people all the time, like, it was local, like, I live in Westchester County, New York. But then as, the Times piece came out, and then like people see on, so I've gone to the White House now, like there's a real interest in this. When parents reach out and their young people are in the throes of this, I always say, like, your goal right now is to get the right care for your child. Like, you're not ready to join this movement because you need to put all of your energy into a system that's pretty much a failure, and you need to kind of find the right places and do the things you need to do. But the other thing is, a lot of the parents and the family members and the loved ones, boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, wives, are still being taught, like, write contracts. It's very abstinence based. It's punitive. Like, don't you want it badly enough? Kick people out, disengage. And there are protocols like CRAFT, community reinforcement and family training, that are rooted in motivational interviewing, that are designed to like create healthy boundaries, but real love and support. And we kind of walk the line between pushing against that old fashioned belief of like kicking your child out and being safe and healthy as well. And it was just something we tried to figure out, but there are really ways to do that that are much more helpful. Like, parents shouldn't have to, you shouldn't have to try to figure it out on your own and hope for the best and hope that you can rely on the kindness of strangers who you think are professionals in the field and may not have a whole lot of experience.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know for a fact my mom didn't know other people were out there talking about these things, or didn't know to listen to a podcast or anything like that when she was experiencing it. So I just think it's so great to be able to get your voice out there and teach people. I mean, I've even learned things as you're speaking that we just really didn't learn growing up. And I just remember like being in health class and assemblies, and there's so much of even what you've just said in the past couple minutes that we just didn't learn. And I think it's so great that you're going around and being able to spread this message.
Yeah, so even New York State, there's actually legislation floating around to include co-occurring disorders in the health curriculum. So, I'm hoping that there are messengers and ambassadors and people that are really going to start spreading this message. And, between the millennials and Gen Z, like, it'll start creeping and crawling. But if you could actually include in a health curriculum co-occurring disorders as the bridge between the units on mental health and substance use, to at least start, like, infusing the words into, like, common everyday life, like, that's a home run, Why, again, what's the secret? Like, why wouldn't you want to say it? And I think there's also a challenge right now with, like, one pill will kill. Like, we're in the middle of a fentanyl crisis, but fentanyl is now being infused with xylazine, and Narcan is not as effective when so we're always sort of like chasing the supply. There's always going to be a substance of the day. There's always going to be like cartels trying to kill us, drug trafficking, border control. Yes, but why is the demand so high? Why are people navigating to this? And I think that is part of the human condition, that we can spend a lot more positive, proactive time. Like, if I spent all of my time after Harris died going to Florida where he died and figuring out everything wrong with the system and going after the kid who brought the pills that killed him, that would be where I would live, and it would not be an empowering, hopeful space. Like, watching the light bulbs go off, watching the connections get made, watching the ways that people can change the world, one conversation at a time. Like, there is like hope. Like, I feel Harris with me every day, every time I'm talking about this. And I'm thinking, this is what he would want people to know, is that, a kid like me ended up in this situation. And there were so many marks along the way where it could have been different.
Yeah. Wow. That is just so profoundly powerful, because I do think people are chasing exactly what you're saying, looking at what's happened afterwards and not trying to prevent it from happening before. Because exactly what you said, if you would have just died on the hill of trying to figure out exactly where those pills came from and why it happened or how it happens, like, that's not ever going to change anything. And right. Instead, you're using your experience to go out and change people's minds and change people's perspectives. And that is just so phenomenal, because I think it's really going to hit a lot of kids, because I don't think they understand it. And still, even what you're saying, like, regardless, some people are going to start experimenting and are going to start trying their kids. And I don't think there's a way. There's a DARE program. There's so many things that have been around. And it's really not, that's not something that's ever worked. So for them to be able to just have education, I think, is the most important. So then the light bulbs do go off.
Yes.
When they start experiencing these symptoms. And because a lot of times people don't even know what to look out for. Right. And I know I didn't. Like, I mean, growing up, I thought the alcoholic was the little man under the bridge that's homeless and is 60 years old and lost everything. Like, I just didn't even know a fraction of what is out there and what's going on. And I didn't even know the definition of an alcoholic, really. Like, they just weren't really teaching what can actually happen when you get into these substances. Right. And I didn't even know how you just said about alcohol kills more people than drugs and suicide. I had no idea.
Yes. So it's, and those are the kind of things I think we keep a secret. But I will say, one of my favorite parts when I present is, I always say, my wish, all of you, especially 25 and under, that you're abstinent from substances, like always, right? That you never open the door. But my hope is that if you're not part of that community that's abstinent, you really start thinking about your why. And so, I've given out probably like well more than 100,000 bracelets at this point. If I told you how many direct messages I get in the middle of the night from a young person who's at a party and they're like, all of a sudden I heard your voice in my head, like, what's my why? Like, why am I doing this? And I realized I wasn't doing this because I wanted to have more fun. I was doing this, I wanted to be more sexually promiscuous. I wanted to let down my guard. I wasn't feeling comfortable here. Like, I need to talk to somebody. And I'm like, that's what we're talking about. This is not a line in the sand where it's you're good or you're bad. And even like you say the word alcoholic, and I'm going to say I'm very language focused. If you're somebody in recovery, if you want to call yourself an alcoholic or an addict, that is your choice. But exactly what you said, when you think of an addict, are you thinking of like the future astronomer, the loving son, the best friend, the teacher, or are you thinking about somebody like unshowered underneath the overpass? I believe that a lot of this terminology that's so stigmatizing is designed to deflect from the failure of the system. And I think that if you call a young person in a program an addict often enough, that's all they ever think they're going to be. They don't see the hope. And so even there, I'm so kind of language focused. I know that for people who are in recovery and have gone through different programs, that is part of their identity. And I don't challenge that. But for young people who are learning about this for the first time, I think that it's so important to not think of like what I think of when I think of those people. Those people are our people.
Yeah,
And
it's
kind
everyone.
words and kindness and loving thoughts go a much longer way.
Yeah, definitely. That's amazing that you're getting those messages of people reaching out and all of that. Do you feel like that feeds your motivation to keep moving forward with this? And
Absolutely. I will say that I started this all on a wing and a prayer. I had a vision in the prevention and early intervention side. And I remember going in, as a former PTA president, having brought in programs. I went into one school district and the principal said to me, like, where's the evidence behind what you want to do? Because everything's built on evidence-based practices. Well, there are no evidence-based practices for co-occurring disorders and prevention. And I found a study, and it said the time between the onset of a mental health disorder and the development of a subsequent substance use disorder is an important window of opportunity where co-occurring disorders can be prevented. You know what he said to me? Get busy, because I can look at my senior class and know who could be dead within a year or two. If you do anything to change that, then you've done your job. And that was kind of like my call to action early on. I went into an alternative school, like a school where they had extension cords. The kids are shuffling into this dark auditorium. It was a gym, and everybody had a 1-to-1 aid. There's all these adults around the rooms that kids are in, and they're like, what is she going to talk to them about? And Harris's poem is in my presentation. And I did a TED Talk recently and I had to read it out loud, which I never do. I usually have the audience read it to themselves. The kids read the poem and I clicked the slide like a couple of seconds too soon. And you know what happens when you do that? You hear that murmur like, wait, go back, I'm not done. I clicked and went back like I always would, and I looked up and the adults were like, what is going on? These are kids who have, they're in foster care. They have parents who are incarcerated. They're one step away from incarceration themselves. And they were fully engaged in a 45-minute presentation with facts and information and Harris's story through his words. And I thought, this is going to make a difference. This is where I'm going to get my power from, because young people who need help and support and are resistant are seeing maybe I should talk to somebody. This is not just me. This is a real common experience. So I definitely feed much more on the prevention, the youth engagement, the college stuff. We have awareness games. There are teams that have our logo in a decal on their helmets, their cleats, their sticks, because families won't come to hear me speak on a Thursday night in the auditorium, but if all of the messaging and the field announcements are around this, they're changing the conversation. Our athletes have games for disorders that are never going to cancer, all the things that people know about, they're important, but nothing like co-occurring disorders impacts them so profoundly, and they can educate their whole community.
Yeah.
We have youth summits, materials and activities. We celebrate in April because Harris's birthday was April 8th, and I thought, if this hits, I'm always going to have something to do on his birthday, and so we're just wrapping up a whole bunch of April, but now we're leaning into May because everybody's like, well, we still want to do CODA tied to Mental Health Awareness Month. Oh, we want to do CODA in October because that's when Red Ribbon Week is and it leans into substance use. So what I'm finding is that our kids, our young people they're like, this is an everyday 365 day a year thing. We don't want to limit it to just a month.
That's amazing. And it is a 365 day a year issue, because these are not issues that take off for holidays or birthdays or anything like that. And it's really something that needs to be addressed. And it's great that you're getting out there and addressing it, because through education is the only way that things are ever going to change. So thank you for taking the time to come on here and educate everyone on here, and go around and educate schools and educate myself. And you're just making such a large impact on so many people, and thank you so much for coming on.
And I learned so much from you
real.
too. Yeah. And so, for people who want to do stuff in this space, like reach out, if you want to do the systems transformation stuff, if you want to look about, how to bring in evidence-based integrated treatment, there's a whole guide. And we're using one in Westchester that's really effective. Like, you have the power to shift the system. You have the power, even if you don't want to do something big, to have those everyday conversations with the people that you care about what this is and what's going on. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate the time with you, Maddie. Thank you.
Of course. And how would you say to reach out to a family that's mourning a death of their child or their brother or their sister that overdosed? Because I feel like when something like that happens in a community, sometimes people feel awkward to reach out and don't know how to approach it and talk about it. What would you say regarding something like that?
So I don't get asked that very often, and I think it's a really important thing. I think that saying the person's child's name, talking about experiences that you had with that child, like keeping them alive and not avoiding is really important. It's not about you, and I love my friends. And I mean, there are times where people are crying and I'm like, and I have it too. I'm like, okay, we're good. Like, are we good? And I think that being able to be emotional, like that's okay. Like, you're not going to scare off a parent whose child died because you're emotional and crying about it. Harris, like I said, died when he was 19, and the people who really were able to stay connected with me are the people who are still really close in my life. I have a lot of great friends who've never experienced anything like this. It's not I'm always going to win the game of like who has it worse, but that doesn't mean that I don't want to validate what you're going through in your life and whatever struggles you have. But also it doesn't go away after the beginning. So stay connected, the few months out. We watched Harris's friends, start their careers, the ones who went to college, graduate from college. That was hard. Mm-hmm. Now, his friends are getting engaged. So we just went to our first wedding. It was hard. And I had friends who said to me, like, that must have been really hard for you. Or like, I don't know if I would have been able to do that. And you think like, oh, should I say that to somebody? Yes, you should, because it's an unnatural experience, and love and support, even if you hit a couple of bumps or you don't say it quite right, like the caring is what matters. Like, don't say things like you'll get over it, because you're never going to get over it. Don't say, this too shall pass, because it's not, it's a very unnatural experience. But love and support from friends, strangers, the number of times like I get a hug from a stranger who's just like, I'm thinking about somebody who I care about and I really connected and related. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important, because I do think it's something people feel avoidant and awkward about and don't know what to say. And exactly what you said, they feel like they're going to get something wrong. And I just feel like sometimes, unfortunately, when there's tragedy, people pull away because they don't want to say something wrong, or they don't want to mess up, or think that the person doesn't want to hear from them, when in reality, you need community and support more 100%. Than ever.
And you don't want it to just be people in grief. Like, and I'm going to say, for grief groups, for people who get like their strength from that, it's great. But for me, I wanted my regular world to be able to have me talk about Harris openly. Like, I talk about him like he could have been here 2 days ago. Things that like how he would have reacted to the world that we live in right now. He's very present. But then also, don't forget about the siblings, because I will say that in any given family, each person's experience with that loss is different. We don't grieve the same way in my family. Harris had Jensen, my daughter, and my husband. We all approach this differently. We all kind of share. We all get upset at different times and get hit different ways. And someone's like, oh, I'm sorry you're upset right now, but I'm good, And I think that really acknowledging that we read about like the pathways of grief, or what, it's not the same for everybody.
Yeah.
And acknowledging that is really important.
Definitely. And I'm gonna ask your daughter to come on as well to tell her story, because it is so different for every single person in the family. But thank you so much for coming on and getting real with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in and getting real with us. Podcasts will be posted every other Wednesday on Spotify and YouTube. Please reach out via DM if you want to chat.